Hey guys, welcome to another painting video. Today I will show you all the tricks I use to paint great looking red armor on my minis. I will be using the Ironman Hulkbuster armor from Marvel Crisis Protocol for this, but you can use the same method for your Warhammer Dreadnoughts or Infinity Techs too. This Ironman mini has been gathering dust on my shelf for a long time, but recently I got into playing Marvel Rivals and watching all the Avengers movies in between painting and video editing sessions. And since one of my favorite characters in both is Mr. Tony Stark, I thought this is the perfect opportunity to finally give this beautiful model the paint job it deserves. Today I will be focusing on how to paint his signature red armor, but if you are interested in how I painted the rest of the model, like the gold trim, the mechanical metal elements, and the flames and smoke of the rocket exhausts, then don't worry, I will be publishing several PDF and longer form video guides about this project on my Patreon. So if you still won't have enough of me going on about highlighting this and shading that after watching this video and you want to know more about how I painted this model, then join me on Patreon, get access to a ton of painting guides and help support the channel at the same time for only a couple of bucks. Alright, after the shameless self-promotion worthy of Mr. Stark, let's get some paint on this bad boy. Red can be a very difficult color to get right, especially when you work on large surfaces like the Hulkbuster armor or an Imperial Knight or Dreadnought in Warhammer 40k for example. But after a lot of trial and error, I think I managed to come up with a pretty reliable method to paint something that will have the right amount of shading and highlighting and will also read as a nice, vibrant and saturated red. And the first step to do that is to base coat the red panels in a color that will be slightly darker and a different tone compared to what we want as our main color. I start by painting a base coat covering everything with multiple layers until I get completely opaque coverage without any of the black showing through. Ideally, this color should be something that is darker and a little more bluish than the primary red I want the armor to be in the end. Corn red from Citadel is great for this task, since it has great coverage and it is darker and a little more on the blue side than for example Mephiston red. You can do this step with an airbrush as well and it will be much faster, but I like doing this by brush since the end result will have a different finish and you will end up with a color that is less desaturated than what you would get by spraying it on. Once all the panels are covered in red and everything is nice and opaque, it is time to establish the actual midtones and the first highlights. Since these are pretty big surfaces, I like to use the airbrush for this since it's much faster and it is easier to create the big smooth transitions we need at this stage. I will do the rest of the highlights by brush, but for establishing the big highlights and shading on the volumes, the airbrush is much better. And the first highlight is probably the most important to get right. I call this a highlight, but this will actually be the midtone of the armor, basically the color that will dominate the model. I used one of my favorite colors, Cartacci Red from Chimera Colors for this, but if you don't have this color, you can also use Mephiston Red from Citadel with a little corn red mixed in. A 90% Mephiston Red and 10% corn red mix will be a pretty close match, I reckon. I diluted this just enough to come out smoothly from the airbrush. You don't need to shoot this as a glaze or something like that. We actually need coverage here so we can get a nice vibrant result. I sprayed it with an airbrush basically from a zenithal angle, but I applied it a little more targeted than a normal zenithal highlight. Also, instead of placing the source of the light directly in the middle above the model's head, I concentrated on the left side a little more as if the light came from above its left shoulder. This will make the end result a little more dramatic and interesting once all the highlights are applied. Anything that was facing up received the coat of this. If it was completely facing up, it got covered almost fully. If it was at an angle, I covered the top of the volume and left the bottom in the darker color. And if it was facing down, I left it in the original corn red. Ideally, once we are done with it, this color will dominate on the red panels facing up, but there should be still plenty of the darker color visible if we look at the bottom side of the panels. And with that, we managed to turn the corn red into our shadow color and the Cartacci Red is now our midtone. So now that the midtone was established, I could work on the actual highlights. For this I used a much more orangish red, Tuluidin Red from Chimera. If you don't have this, you can use Evil Sun Scarlet from Citadel to replace it. The Citadel colors will have more white in them, so the end result will be probably less vibrant and a bit more washed out, but don't worry, we will fix that later on. This one went into the same spots as the previous one, but on a smaller surface, covering around half of the area we sprayed with the previous Cartacci Red. The dilution was also the same, no need to thin it down too much, but you can play with the amount of layers you spray. If you spray 1 or 2 layers on a slightly larger surface and then add more layers in the middle, you can create a natural transition on the panel between this color and the previous one. Aside from the speed, this effortless creation of smooth transitions is one of the reasons using an airbrush for projects like this is so necessary and also super satisfying. For the next highlight I will switch to a pure orange, so I will be reducing the size of these highlights quite a bit inside the previous one so we don't risk overpowering the reds. The color I used here was orange from Chimera, which is super pigmented and vibrant. The best match I know in Citadel would be Troll Layer Orange. I didn't shoot this on all the panels, only on the ones that would be hit by the light the most. Remember that we imagined that the light comes from above the left shoulder of the model. So I was concentrating on the top of the right leg, the shoulders, the top of the head, the top of the fingers and the chest armor, especially on the left side. And finally, I added one more step which I would consider optional. I wanted to go even further with the highlights, so I added a couple of light spots in the most prominent places with light orange from AK Interactive. Fire Dragon Bright from Citadel would be a good equivalent. This has quite a bit of white in it, so I had to be super careful operating with low pressure and high dilution. I wasn't super happy with the result though, so later you will see me mostly erasing this step with another, but without it the end result would look slightly different, so I wanted to still mention it. Okay, with that we are done with the airbrush highlights. I will be using the brush to go brighter with the highlights from this point on. And as a reminder, we started from a dark bluish red, established the midtone with something closer to a primary red, and then created the big volumetric highlights of the panels with more and more orange colors until we reached the pure orange on a small surface. So we will go from there with the brush, but first we have one more important thing to take care of. The corn red in the shadows is nice, but it's not dark enough. We need a little more contrast on the armor, so we need to deepen the shadows a bit. Blue and green are both pretty good shadow tones for red. They certainly beat pure black in this regard, so my favorite paint for this is Dark Sea Blue, which is a dark blue-green color. And not only is this a great color to contrast with red, but it will also work as a great shadow tone for the gold elements as well, and coincidentally it works great with the bluish corn red. I shot this very diluted, something like 20% paint and 80% airbrush thinner, and with low pressure from a reverse zenithal angle, or nadir angle if you will. Ideally this goes inside the corn red shadows, in some places completely covering them, but in most cases leaving some visible to establish a nice continuous transition between all the tones. Now we have all the colors except the brush highlights, but since I used the airbrush the colors got a little muted, and that's probably even more true if you use Citadel colors on yours. The solution is to take a nice vibrant and transparent red ink, in my case Blood Scarlet from AK Interactive, thin it down to make it even more transparent and glaze this over the midtones. I wasn't particularly careful with this, but I tried not hitting the deepest shadows and the brightest highlights, except in some cases where I wanted to fix the two whitish spots I made with the light orange. But it is better to go slow with this, applying many thin layers, because it can suddenly become too much and obscure the highlighting we had done before. There, that looks much more vibrant and colorful, doesn't it? And that concluded the airbrushing part of the project, so before I put the airbrush down, I took some matte and gloss varnishes and mixed them about 50-50 to get a satin mix. You can of course also use a satin varnish directly if you have some. I sprayed this over all the red panels. This will protect my work and it will make it easier to wipe away any mistakes I make with the brush, while also not muting the colors like a matte varnish would. Now comes my favorite part of the painting process. While airbrushing I stained a lot of the elements around the red panels, so now it's time to clean those up. Thanks to the varnish, which I let curing for a day or so, if I make a mistake I could simply wipe it away with a damp brush. But it is best to go slowly and be as precise as possible, avoiding mistakes while enjoying how much more defined the model becomes through this step. At this stage I also base coated all the bits that were supposed to be gold later. As I said earlier, if you are interested in how I did that part, I will be uploading the tutorials on my Patreon in the next couple of weeks. Before continuing the highlights, there is one more very important thing I needed to take care of to make the model way more defined: blacklining all the panels. With the airbrush I painted not only the top of the panels but also every crevice and recess on the model as well, and now it's time to fix that. To do this I thinned down some dark sea blue on the wet palette. As a reminder, this is the same color I used for the shading step earlier. I used the tip of the brush to drop this into every crevice and corner as well as between every panel. The ideal dilution is hard to describe, but it's something between a glaze and a layer consistency, thin enough to flow into the crevices but thick enough to not just flow everywhere uncontrollably. This step might look daunting, but it's actually quite easy and only takes a few minutes. If you make a mistake, simply wipe it away with a damp brush or your finger and try again. Ideally, every single element of the model should have a dark outline with this color. This will make everything way more contrasty and crisp looking. Now we are really in the home stretch, and the only thing we need to do is to add definition to the armor with brush highlights. And we will start with the same orange color that we also use for the airbrush highlights, so Troll Slayer orange if you are using Citadel colors. If you like doing edge highlights, you will enjoy this step since you will get to do a lot of those, and if you have issues with edge highlights, I suggest watching my dedicated video about it. People seem to find it useful. I highlighted every single edge on the red panels with this color. And this first highlight doesn't need to be particularly thin, but it has to go on every single edge, and that includes fake edges as well, meaning that wherever we painted the dark sea blue line, there should be an orange highlight next to it on both sides. So not just on the sculpted edge, but also on the bare panel as well next to the dark line. On top of this, I also added a lot of small scratches on the panels, mostly coming in at an angle from the edge. This helps make the armor more interesting and masks the airbrush look we created with the highlights. Coincidentally, I have a guide about doing these scratches on the channel as well, so you might want to check that out too. And there's a ton of surface to cover on this big model, so I will leave you a little bit more footage here so you can see where and how I made the highlights and the scratches. Once I was done with the orange, it was time to push the highlights even further, so now I selected warm yellow from Chimera, which is basically halfway between orange and yellow. If you're using Citadel colors, the best bet is probably to use Iria yellow with a little Fire Dragon Bright mixed in to make it slightly more orangish. I used this a little more selectively. I painted it on all the edges that were facing up towards the light, and I concentrated mostly on the areas that were in the light, leaving the rest highlighted with only the previous color. I also continued adding scratches, but now only in the light areas and whenever I could inside the previous larger scratches. Once again, I will leave a little more footage here so you can observe me doing this. Now we are almost there. I just needed to add one final brighter highlight. For this one I used Cold Yellow from Chimera, which you can replace with Phalanx Yellow from Citadel. As you can see, now we have a huge range of colors on the panels. It goes from a very dark green-blue in the deepest shadows through shades of red and orange all the way up to a bright yellow in the highlights. But the most important thing is that despite all the other colors in the shadows and the highlights, the armor still reads as red. I painted this light yellow only on the edges that were hit by the light the most, especially on the upper torso, the arms, the hands and the right leg. I covered only a few edges fully, most of them I only painted partially or only on the corners, and I still added tiny scratches as usual. And with that, Iron Man's red armor is done and the end result looks like this. I have to admit that I'm quite proud of this one. I think the paint job is definitely better than my current skills in either Crisis Protocol or Marvel Rivals, so I think it's time for me to play a little bit more. But what do you guys think? Is the end result worthy of Iron Man? Do you want me to paint any other Marvel characters, or are you only into Warhammer and Infinity? Let me know in the comments. I hope you guys found this guide useful. If you did, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. And before I sign off, I wanted to remind you once again that the painting guides for this project and many more besides are available on my Patreon. And my Patreon members are the ones that make this channel possible, so they deserve a huge thank you as always, especially the ones in the Captain level. Thanks again for watching and see you guys in the next one.